Morning. Do you know the difference between machine learning and artificial intelligence? Well, machine learning, they say, is written in Python, whereas artificial intelligence is written using PowerPoint. Welcome to this week's Digital Exchange newsletter. So this week, I was at the CogX 2020 festival, virtually of course. And as you know, this brings together a lot of the thinkers and practitioners of artificial intelligence, not just from the UK but across the world. And the thing that surprised me more than anything else this year is how many of the experts in the field have suddenly started talking about not just how good AI can be, but how important it is to retain the human being in the frame and how limited AI is in the context of competing with humans. Now, I find that really interesting, perhaps counterintuitive, and maybe it is a reaction to the world that we're in the post-COVID scenario with the amount of the challenges and automation threatening to take over more and more jobs. Maybe there's a kind of political and philosophical leaning back towards valuing the human. So, with that in mind, I thought I would try and outline what I see as the five key premises of AI, especially in the context of bias, which is one of the most important criticisms that we see in AI today. So, the first premise is that human beings are really intelligent, but a lot of human work isn't. And by that, I mean, ever since the dawn of the Industrial Revolution, we have continued to dumb down human work into essentially what would be termed as robotic, repetitive, and working off a very narrow script. Whether you're a factory worker on a production line doing the same thing over and over again, or you're a call center employee who must ask the same questions in the same order, irrespective of what the customer at the other end wants to know. We've kind of turned these people who are otherwise normal human beings into essentially very narrowly focused robotic beings. And while AI could not claim to be anywhere as intelligent as these human beings, it can absolutely do these narrow robotic jobs better than human beings can for a number of reasons. AI doesn't get tired, it doesn't make the same kind of mistakes, and increasingly, with call center employees having a tenure of 2 years or thereabouts in a call center, you have to keep retraining new generations of call center employees, whereas your AI, over let's say a 5-year period, will get exponentially better at solving those problems. The second premise is about intelligence and consistency. The human beings are incredibly inconsistent. We consider a range of let's say 100 to 160 as kind of the IQ range, where 160 represents genius level of IQ. But we don't, as many authors have pointed out, we don't have a word for what constitutes an IQ of 1,600 or 16,000. And that's a separate matter altogether. But even for our given range of intelligence, there's such a massive variety of how well human beings perform the same tasks. Whether it's driving or gardening or teaching, you'll have a fascinating variety of different kinds of competences within the same task that different human beings perform. You can be a rash driver, an aggressive driver, a safe driver, and all of these will still be considered good drivers. And so when we think about comparing human beings with AI, which of these human beings are we talking about? And that's not the only problem. The same person, you or me, will have a vastly differing level of competence for the same task, for example, driving, depending on our time of day, our stress levels, our levels of distraction, the amount of alcohol that we may have consumed, and of course over age and so many other factors. Now, again, that brings us to the point of when we start comparing AI to human beings for any task, which level of competence are we assuming for the human beings? The third premise is about narrow intelligence and how AI and human beings differ even on that score. When we talk about AI, we distinguish between general intelligence, which is the human-like ability to perform a number of different tasks, from cooking to gardening to driving a car to playing chess, and narrow intelligence, which is typically where AI is focused on, which is the ability to do one task really well. For example, play chess. Now, when you and I play chess, we see a number of different levels of abstraction. We see kings and queens, we see hierarchies, we see bishops and knights, and they conjure up different kinds of images for us. We see wars and battlefields and tactics and sacrifice and offense and defense. And AI sees none of this. It has its own abstractions, which would make no sense to you and me. But fundamentally, what an AI program playing chess is doing is that it's almost trained to have a Pavlovian reaction towards winning positions. It sees a reward every time it can move to a better position, and that's what it continuously tries to do. And in that sense, we mustn't confuse narrow AI with a human being performing a narrow task. They aren't the same. Our fourth premise, therefore, brings us to the point of bias. Even while performing these narrow tasks, we are making decisions, as is an artificial intelligence system, and the question arises about what kind of biases are creeping into that decision-making process. Now, it has, of course, been well documented that AI is prone to biases, and those biases are typically the result of learning from data that has been inherited from human decision-making over years. And of course, there are biases in that data which is then carried forward by AI systems. Now, in this way, you almost have to see an AI system as a child that is exposed to years and years of misogyny may think that that's normal, and that may become a part of that child's normal makeup. And that's a bias that creeps in, therefore. And so that's how AI itself becomes biased. It is an inherited bias. And last week, if you remember, we talked about how Microsoft had replaced news desk people with machine learning systems. And of course, exactly a week later, that AI system has been in trouble for confusing the two members of the pop group Little Mix because they are of mixed race. Now, of course, this is happened because of it being trained on data that perhaps made the same mistake earlier. And you can almost imagine someone saying a human being would never have done that. As it turns out, just a while back, the BBC had to apologize for confusing Kobe Bryant with LeBron James. And a couple of years back, an Irish newspaper had to apologize similarly for confusing the images of Romelu Lukaku, the footballer, with Stormzy, the musician. So it's not as though human beings don't make these mistakes. And in fact, the reason why AI makes them is because human beings have made them for years and years. Which brings me to my last premise, which is that bias in AI can be identified and fixed easier than biases in human decision making. Why do I say this? Well, first of all, think of the number of different biases we are prone to. This kind of racial bias or gender bias that's been in the news is just one or two of the many biases human brains are subject to. We suffer from anchoring bias, halo bias, confirmation bias. All of these things are part and parcel of our makeup. And in fact, these biases in some ways help us make sense of the world and get through the day. Otherwise, our brains would not be able to handle the level of complexity we deal with. So there are ways in which our brain simplifies decision making. And if you had to then say, well, would you rather have a human being or an AI to make an important decision? I think science and the politically correct answer right now would suggest that both is the right option. if you can have a human being and an AI system working together, you might get the best possible results. But what if you didn't have that option? What if you had to choose? Well, then it might boil down to the kind of tasks. If you're doing something more complicated like driving or gardening, maybe that's something that requires a broader range of skills that AI isn't ready for as yet. On the other hand, if you're doing something like playing chess or taking some very narrow decisions such as recognizing images, then perhaps the fact that the AI can have a bias is much easier to spot and correct with the right data and training than the range of biases that a human being might have in looking at that same data. Because it's taken us decades, hundreds of years to identify and spot these biases in ourselves. And if I had to choose between which one I would rather try to fix, the bias in AI or the bias in humans, I know which one I choose. So that's the summary of our newsletter this week. We also have an excellent book review about Shoshana Zuboff's thought-provoking book on the world we're in, especially given that this week we've had the news about IBM and a few others deciding to stop work on facial recognition technologies. So we're at a tipping point in some of these technologies, especially in the way that they deal with social and political issues. And I think that will be a good space to watch. But in the meanwhile, enjoy the newsletter. Do let us know what you think about it. Follow the links. And if you can, then subscribe and spread the word.